there are times in life when it's wise to apologise for one's shortcomings at the very beginning, and I think that this could very well be such an occasion. So just let me explain that I'm neither a historian nor a good public speaker, as you're about to discover. I stand before you at the behest of Dean Townley, who I discovered has great powers of persuasion. In fairness, I must say that he has recently provided me with some additional information on Armour, for which I am grateful. What he doesn't know yet is that I'm depending on him to field any awkward questions at the end. So this little paper is really the result of some research that I started on shortly after I retired. And I was interested in J.B. Armour for two main reasons. And the first one was that he was from the same locality in North Antrim, and he grew up in the same church congregation, First Kilrat's Presbyterian, although obviously not at the same time. Kilrat's is a parish of Townlands. It's 6 miles north of Ballymoney. Armour's father was an elder and treasurer in that congregation. And J.B. Armour later founded the first secondary school in Ballymoney. It remains today as Dalriada School, which I attended in the last century. The second reason is that he seemed to me to be quite an intriguing character, because his views seemed to be the opposite of what might have been expected of someone in his position at that time on several issues that we will come to shortly. It seems that he was prepared to swim against the current when required. In other words, he was prepared to stand against what was popular at the time, generally, if he believed that it was right to do so. And his whole life, I think, could fairly be described as a constant struggle for the liberty of the individual, and he opposed the vested interests of the establishment in his time in relation to different issues to secure what he considered to be basic human rights for individuals. And this led to campaigns on education, tenant rights, and home rule. A note in the Ordnance Survey memoir for the parish of Kilrat's, written in the 1830s, states that, quote, no remarkable person was ever born in the parish. This was soon to be rectified when James Brown Armour was born on a farm in the centre of that parish. He was the youngest of 6 children, and he was to become one of the most controversial figures in Irish Presbyterianism, a legend in his own lifetime. He stood for the rights and liberty of each individual, regardless of the frown or favour of men, and of course this brought him into conflict with certain vested interests. After primary school, he went to Royal Belfast Academical Institution and went on then to study classics. He gained a BA from Queen's College Cork and an MA from Queen's College Belfast, after which he studied theology in the Presbyterian College. He was ordained in his first and only charge, Second Ballymoney, later known as Trinity, in July 1869. The church building or meeting house was in a poor state when he went there, and Armour set about replacing it. An attractive building of sandstone with a tower and spire was erected. I think that's a picture of it there. And this was Armour's own idea, this architectural design, and it was very different from the typical barn style of most Presbyterian churches at that time. And for generations, it was referred to as Armour's meeting house. And I actually remember it being called that. Armour's manse was open house to all in the district in trouble, regardless of class or creed. The Reverend J.B. Armour was very clear as to respective functions of minister and elder in terms of church government. The idea that a minister should be the mouthpiece of any group in the church was as repugnant to him as that a session should stand between the minister and the congregation. In his own case, for the 54 years of his long ministry, he kept in harmony with both, and I'm sure that was probably quite an achievement. An article in the British Weekly stated about Armour: a devoted pastor, an eloquent preacher, a first-rate public speaker, Mr. Armour has been above all things a man of grit, who never shrank from speaking out on what he believed, and in whom those who sought his help and counsel never failed to find a friend. The Reverend and Mrs. Armour had 3 sons, William, Max and Kenneth. William, who became a barrister, had been president of the Oxford Union as a student. He later founded the Young Farmers' Clubs of Ulster, and for a time he was editor of the Northern Whig. Max was a minister of the church in Canada, and Kenneth was classics master at Campbell College, Belfast. So if we think about Armour's involvement in education, Armour was passionate about education, and he founded a secondary school in Ballymoney in 1878 and was its first headmaster. The school was initially called Ballymoney Intermediate School. There were 30 pupils. They were drawn from all denominations, and 8 of them were girls. School hours were from 10 a.m. until 3 p.m. with a half-hour break for lunch. However, those pupils who depended on the narrow-gauge train to Ballycastle for transport home had to leave at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Writing of the school in his biography of his father, Mr. W.S. Armour noted, "There was a local committee, but the school was run on lines which did not promise much pecuniary emolument to the first principal. Those who could not pay were eagerly accepted, and parents who perhaps could have paid were often excused, as he had ideas that payment meant domestic hardship and financial struggle. One pupil remembered the receipt of a pile of books for which he proposed to pay." So Armour promptly hurled one at him, telling him to go home and try to get the contents of it into his head rather than worry about payment. Although his temper may have been short at times, the consensus is that he was a gifted teacher. It was said he could control the whole class with a glance. Maybe that should be a glare. And if he spoke in italics in the morning, he was likely to bring in some apples later on. One of his phrases was, "Did I ever see such a gomish as you are?" He taught on his own until 1880 with little or no financial reward. He resigned in 1882 and he wrote to a friend, "I am glad in one way that I am giving it up, as it is beginning to be a financial success." The school later moved to a new building and became known as Dalriada School, which still exists today as a voluntary grammar school, with one of the houses being named after the first headmaster. The Reverend J.B. Armour also lectured from 1885 in Magee College in Derry for 23 years. He taught Latin, Greek and catechetics. He travelled to Derry by the 8 a.m. train, and it was said that he was never late. He often spoke at the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland on education matters. Armour was a member of the first Senate of Queen's University. During his term of service, a chair of Celtic Studies was established, together with a lectureship in scholastic philosophy. Dr. R.W. Livingstone, who was Vice-Chancellor of Queen's at that time, said he always thought that Armour belonged to a heroic world and carried with him its atmosphere into a lesser age. So if we go on then to his involvement with tenant rights. A few months after Armour was ordained in Ballymoney, the ROUTE, R-O-U-T-E, Tenant Right Association was founded in Ballymoney for the purpose of opposing landlordism and agitating for better conditions for tenants. The ROUTE just refers to a geographical area of North Antrim. And this became known as the campaign for the 3 Fs, fair rent, fixed day of tenure and free sale. They thought that the tenant should be able to sell his interest in the land and should not be evicted if he paid his rent, which should be set at a fair rate. J.B. Armour was a key figure in this association. He was described as having brought a tongue of fire to it. His dislike of landlordism dated from an incident he witnessed in his youth. He recalled in a speech in 1880, and this is direct quotation, "I remember distinctly a scene before a hotel door. An old man, barely clothed, with the appearance of hard toil written on his face and frame, stood with his head exposed to the falling snow, begging not bread, but, as I afterwards learned, the liberty of remaining on the farm, which was hallowed by the association of generations, from a haughty little man who seemed fonder of his cigar than the tail of his tenant. His dogs were nicely covered to keep them from the snow, but the hard-toiled man was expected and allowed to stand uncovered. When I later learned that the little despot evicted him as the farm was wanted for another purpose, without compensation, I vowed that if ever God gave me an opportunity, I would use what little strength was mine to drive a nail into the coffin of a system which was not only the negation of justice, but so battered the moral qualities out of men that they could not look their fellow mortals in the face without their hat in their hand, nor speak save in a bondsman's key. As the years went on, the demand for the 3 Fs grew stronger, and the Reverend Armour made speeches at tenant right meetings all over the country, demanding a revolution in these land laws. The revolution came in 1881 when the 3 Fs were conceded. Armour is mentioned in relation to this in the papers of Michael Davitt, with whom he had cooperated. The 3 Fs led to the destruction of the old landlord-tenant system and new schemes for buying land. This meant that in due course the tenant farmers became the owners of the land. This legislation was pushed through Parliament by the British Prime Minister, William Ewart Gladstone, and he and Armour had become acquainted. This process was referred to for generations as the buying out, or as they called it in North Antrim, the buying out, and it was still talked about for years, years and years later. And the repayment seems to have been made over a long period of time, with only modest sums having to be found annually. So then we come to his involvement with Home Rule. By far the most controversial of the causes espoused by Armour was that of Home Rule. He believed that Irish Home Rule would boost the economy and bring reconciliation between Presbyterians and Roman Catholics. While the Presbyterian farmers of Ulster regarded Gladstone and by association Armour as heroes in removing power from the landlords, and by the religious equality that had come from disestablishment of the Church of Ireland, they deserted them in their droves when it came to Home Rule. The General Assembly, which is the big sort of gathering of the Presbyterian Church annually to this day, called the General Assembly, saw fit to condemn Home Rule every year for about 20 years, and Armour confronted this often single-handedly. He did not object to Presbyterians being Unionists. He was opposed to his church being a branch of a political party. He maintained that a church court, which is what the General Assembly was and is, should not be an instrument for political propaganda. Armour found himself a lone voice within the Presbyterian Church, which had called a special assembly in March 1893 to protest against Home Rule. He tabled an amendment at this assembly, and his speech was met with much disapproval and interruption. Armour demanded his right to speak. He compared those present to dancing dervishes howling against Home Rule. He accused the assembly of trying to make rejection of Home Rule a condition of salvation. He went on to say, "You profess to be afraid that your people will be deprived of their civil rights. I tell you that under no government, conceivable or imaginable, could they have fewer civil rights than they have had in the past." He was convinced that the vested interests of the establishment, their former oppressors, were driving the protests against Home Rule. He concluded his speech by saying that if this special assembly managed to whip up public opinion to supplant Mr. Gladstone's government, then it will be known as the assembly which in its unreasoning passion against Mr. Gladstone, to spite the majority of our countrymen, sold its people into bondage, and through a senseless fear of Romanism sacrificed the power and progress of true Presbyterianism in Ireland for generations. I have copied out the text, the full text of that particular speech, and there are copies available, hopefully enough for everybody who wants one. In 1912, Armour summed up his support for Home Rule in a publication edited by J.H. Morgan as follows. 1. Home Rule is the principle of Presbyterian Church government applied to secular affairs. 2. It would undo many of the evils of the Act of Union. Ireland's prosperity only began with Gladstone's legislation, the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland and tenant right, which was democratic, and Home Rule was the extension of the democratic principle. Far from Home Rule ruining Protestantism, it would give it the chance of being recognised on its merits. Hitherto, it had been identified by the landlords, who were tyrants, and with the bureaucracy, which was largely in the hands of one Protestant sect, which would have been Anglicanism. 4. Home Rule would help and not hinder commerce, and the fears that an Irish Parliament would overtax Ulster were unthinkable, as any taxes would weigh as heavily on other parts of Ireland as on Ulster. He added that some of those who were exploiting the persecution bogey for political ends had, and I quote, not much religion to persecute. While most churches at that time were used for covenant signing, this of course did not happen in Trinity, in Ballymoney, as his biographer states. For Mr. Armour there was no difficulty in the matter, as he had burnt his boats long before, and no one therefore expected him to have ever anything to do with covenant signing. However, it should be noted that Armour did not at any time use his pulpit for the promotion of political opinions. He said that church members and ministers have an inherent right as citizens to have and to express whatever political opinions they may have outside of the church building, but over every church door should be inscribed, "Let no politics enter here, for this place is for the worship of God." By 1913, Carson's campaign against Home Rule was being strongly supported. The UVF had been formed, and they had illegally imported arms, known as the gun running. This absolutely appalled Armour, as did the fact that training went on almost under the nose of the authorities, and no action was taken. The rebellion of Easter 1916 was also a grief to him. But however, where he differed from the majority of those around him was in his belief that the Northerners, by their threat of force and their example, were largely responsible. On May the 24th, 1916, he wrote, "It is dawning on many that the real mistake of the government was in not coming down hard on the gun runners of Ulster, who thought they were doing a great stroke of business for themselves." Of the Sinn Féin prisoners, he wrote, "Leniency should be shown to the dupes." An article in the Republican newspaper An Poblacht on the 23rd of October 2008 comments on this time as follows. "Amidst the political frenzy, there were very few Protestants in Ulster prepared to oppose Carsonism, but there were some, and among them was the Reverend J.B. Armour of Ballymoney, County Antrim, a minister of the Presbyterian Church. Armour stood out from most of his co-religionists in advocating self-government for Ireland. On the 24th of October 1913, Armour organised a meeting of Protestants in support of Home Rule. He asked Roman Catholic supporters not to attend this particular meeting, which was to demonstrate the strength of Protestant support for Home Rule. 500 plus attended the meeting in Ballymoney Town Hall. Banners on the wall read, "Ulster for Ireland and Ireland for Ulster." Ballymoney was chosen because, apart from being Armour's hometown, the district had a radical tradition going back to the United Irishmen of the 1790s, and it had also, of course, been the hotbed of tenant right agitation. Carson had organised an Ulster Day the previous year to launch the signing of the Solemn League and Covenant. Armour dismissed Carson's Ulster Day as Protestant Fool's Day. An alternative Ulster Covenant, which had been written by Armour and Sir Roger Casement, was introduced and signed. Casement, who was executed in 1916, emphasised the links between the Presbyterians of Antrim and the Catholics of Wexford. He thought both had a great contribution to make to an all-Ireland state. A representative of Harland and Wolff called Alec Wilson was also on the platform. Harland and Wolff had indicated at that time that they supported Home Rule. The alternative covenant was signed by some 12,000 Protestants from County Antrim, but it was not enough to turn the tide of Carsonism. The Home Rule question was put in abeyance by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. In February 1919, Armour wrote, "The Irish problem is not advancing to a reasonable solution, but insanity will pass sometime." When partition of Ireland began to be discussed as a solution, Armour was strongly against this. He said this was an unnatural thing, as it would make two Irelands, and it would mean the abandonment of unionists in the south and west of Ireland. In due course, as we know, an agreement based on partition was reached, and it provided Northern Ireland with its own parliament. The Reverend J.B. Armour addressed the Presbyterian General Assembly in 1921 in the following words: "I hope this Parliament will turn out all right, but I am afraid that what Grattan said about the Irish Parliament will probably be true of this Assembly," or Northern Ireland Parliament. Grattan said, "I have watched by its cradle, I have followed its hearse. In my opinion, the time will come when we will rejoice that the hearse has arrived." This is how he ended that speech. "In conclusion, I bid you goodbye, as it is not likely that I will ever appear on this platform again." So with our benefit of hindsight, we can appreciate how visionary those words actually were. So his opponents now conceded that he was a good man who had lived to see the failure of his hopes. His own view was that he had seen his unheeded warnings fulfilled. In his struggle for liberal principles, Armour had to face hostile audiences and risk social ostracism, but he never shrank from either. He also had to forego any prospect of ever attaining the position in the church to which his ability and character entitled him. He never had any chance of becoming moderator, in other words. In the end, even his opponents, while they were not won over by his opinions, were won over by his character. Reverend J.B. Armour retired from active ministry in 1925 and died on the 25th of January 1928 at the age of 87. In his own congregation, he was regarded as an eloquent and thoughtful preacher and a devoted and greatly loved pastor. Someone who knew Armour from his campaigns once wrote to him about a sermon he had heard him deliver and remarked, "I always think of you stiffening the sinews of an audience, leading on crusaders against the world's sins and sorrows. But this sermon was calm and restful." His son, who wrote his biography, said of his father, "Though circumstances made him a warrior, this was not his natural disposition. He was, in reality, a man of great humility, tenderness, and peace." In the fly-leaf of his biography, his son inserted a quotation from the Iliad, "Dear to his fellows, for his dwelling was by the roadside, and he entertained all men." So that's the end of the talk that I prepared. I think it's only fair to mention my main sources. The main one was that biography, Armour of Ballymoney, by W.S. Armour. And I also drew heavily on the work of a local historian who just died a few years ago, Alec Blair, who wrote Kilrat's A Kirk and Its People, and he also wrote History of Dalriada School. And I got some information from Pronai and Public, and Dean Townley got some additional information for me recently as well. So I thank him for that. Thank you very much. Any awkward questions? Dean Townley's here.
Oh, no. Sadie, thank you. And that's thank you from us all. And perhaps we have some questions, but I declare my own interest in Reverend J.B. Armour. And I was really thrilled to know that you had such a personal interest in him and his ministry. You shared common roots spiritually and geographically with him. Yeah. My connection, obscure though it is, with J.B. Armour is through my father, who was taught Latin by Mr. Kenneth Armour. And I also think that he was my father's housemaster in the early mid-30s. I remember my father saying, and I wish now that we pursued this conversation, and he was talking as a County Louth Protestant. So he was not, nor was his family, part of the northern political scene or power. But I remember my father saying that not specifically the Reverend J.B., but the Armours of Ballymoney were the best type or the best representatives of Ulster Presbyterianism. And I wish, as I say, I wish that I'd given my father a chance to really go into that. But are there any questions? I have some additional things to say. Not that anybody could overshadow you. No, not for a moment, Sadie. But anything that would have come up with Sadie's thoughts in your mind?
How many Protestants in Northern Ireland were in favour of home rule?
How many Protestants in Northern Ireland were afraid? That's a statistical question. Sadie.
Well, that figure that I gave was really for that local area, you know, County Antrim. So, but because of Armour, there would have been more support for home rule there than there would have been in some other districts, you know.
He gained, I think, was it 12,000?
Yeah, 12,000. Yeah,
from Antrim, or was it simply North Antrim alone?
Well, they may have come from a bit further away. I don't know. It said County Antrim, you know.
I raise a sort of query here. I don't know who it's addressed to, anybody present, I suppose. But I wasn't surprised to hear of the Reverend Armour's inclinations, particularly politically. And you alluded to this later, Sadie, when you talked about United Irishmen, because he was born only really a generation after they were active. And my understanding of it was that they were particularly active in North Antrim.
Yes, they were.
In the Glens. And so I was almost surprised that he apparently encountered as much resistance as I got the impression maybe he had. But it also set me wondering whether there were other areas where Presbyterianism was very strong, where maybe there were feelings that maybe Holman was not a bad thing. You know, do we have any evidence of this in other areas like in maybe parts of West Tyrone or Big South Armour? I don't know.
I just wouldn't know that. Maybe Robert would like to comment on that.
If there were little pockets.
There were pockets. Were there other pockets?
Yeah.
Particularly where Presbyterianism is strong or was strong, probably still is, where there was this feeling.
I mean, there is the great history, isn't there, of Irish, of Presbyterian espousal of home rule, and you think of the United Irishmen particularly, and that tradition was somewhat eclipsed, wasn't it? Of course, strong though it was, by the rise of
Carson.
Even before that, arguably, in the early 19th century, with Henry Cook and his high Toryism and unveiled dislike and suspicion of the Roman Catholic Church. But in spite of that, in spite of his high Toryism and his influence in other ways, the Presbyterians remained liberal politically, didn't they? Until Gladstone tried to carry them into home rule. It's not answering your question, really. But what historic pockets were there? I don't know.
I'm just wanting to raise the subject. I have a very minor personal interest in it. I suspect my grandfather was partly educated by Armour in Derry. You said
yes, he did. McGee College.
McGee College, yes. I suspect that my grandfather probably attended some of his lectures there. And there was certainly, I discerned a certain liberalism within that part of the family that maybe he was at odds with some of the other connections he had. So,
Yeah, you see, there was pretty much, as far as I can understand from my reading, there really was a very general support for the liberal view in relation to the tenant right issue, for instance, which Gladstone had put through, but Home Rule turned out to be different. Once Carson started to become prominent, and they brought in the guns and all of that, any support for Home Rule seemed to just ebb away. And certainly at that speech in the General Assembly in 1897, I think it was, 1893, he was practically a lone voice, and he had apparently great difficulty in making himself heard at all, but he did assert that he had a right to speak. So, it was overwhelmingly against him.
Because as you said yourself, that the Presbyterians were absolutely with him in his campaign for tenant rights.
Yeah.
Okay, and that politically was set right, mercifully, not a minute too soon. Yeah. But I think you said they deserted him in droves.
That's right.
In his espousal of Home Rule. In 1893, there was a special General Assembly called really to oppose, for the Presbyterian Church to officially oppose Home Rule. And John, it was overwhelming, their opposition, whatever little pockets there might have been historically. And he really was a voice. Will you hold on just a second, please? Just a voice, a prophetic voice, one would argue, in the massive opposition to him, to him personally. Mind you, he didn't. Hard to win friends. At that assembly, he called them God's silly people. And he said that his brethren, fellow Presbyterians, particularly ministers, were friendly and rational in all things, save politics. And he talked from 1 Samuel in the Old Testament of Hophni and Phinehas, who introduced the Ark of God into the battle against the Philistines, and it was a disaster, that battle, and the Israelites were defeated, and the Ark was captured. And he said, he said to the assembly, you think that you can carry God into your side, and no, he really stirred them up. But he virtually saying, "But I believe, that we are under judgment in this matter," but he was consistent in his opposition. Sorry.
Just to mention about the trajectory of what was happening during all this time, going from the 1798 rebellion up to say roughly such a sea change in Presbyterianism, in the sense that the Presbyterians were so allied with Catholics for Catholic emancipation at that time. They were brutally put down by, as they saw, the landowner class, mostly the Church of Ireland. But things changed over the next 50 years where the turmoil of, for example, the Catholic Emancipation Act, the turmoil of the Irish famine, which the population changed dramatically within Ireland, but also, as Sadie has said, the decline of the power of the Church of Ireland landowners, but the rise of Presbyterian industrial revolution, where people, although they had tenancy freedoms, a lot of them moved to the cities and the towns, some involved in working in factories, either oil factories. So there was a total change of power, which I think, as much as anything, made what Reverend Armour was saying very difficult. So he was in a very difficult situation because all these forces were working against his particular view. And once the power switched from the landowners to the industrialists, which were many of which were Presbyterian, then he was on a hiding to nothing. And then with the fear of Daniel O'Connell, Parnell, and on top of that, then coming into the new century, where there was the fear that it would be sold out by him. So it really shifted.
Yes. You know, thanks. Could it be argued that J.B. Armour was out of date, even in 1893 and way before that? The bogey of landlordism. Landlordism was decidedly on the wane, and the Anglican establishment, what a blow it received with its disestablishment of Irish Anglicanism in 1869, where the Presbyterian Church and the Roman Catholic Church were decidedly, in all matters, put on the same and legal footing. And as you say, and so wisely, Armour seems to have ignored the powerful rise of Presbyterianism in industrial and commercial and social influence. In Belfast, the Sinklers, the Kingans, the Workmans, the Clarks, the Sinklers. You know, Presbyterians, they had the money, they had the power, and they were strongly and devotedly Presbyterian. And if there was a symbol, surely architecturally, of Presbyterian power and confidence, arguably against the Anglicans, it was in the erection of the magnificent Assemblies College. It's not such Assembly buildings in the early 20th century. So Presbyterianism was mightily powerful at a time when Armour was still slanging the Anglicans and landlordism. Would you agree, or any other thoughts?
The English government wanted the army and the Curragh to go up and fight the UVF, and the UVF was operating against Home Rule.
Yes.
And why was that? I went to a talk about, I think it was Dennis Wilson, who persuaded the army and the Curragh to mutiny and refused to go north to defeat the UVF.
Yeah, well, that was a very well known incident.
Yes.
Wasn't it, the Curragh mutiny?
Yes, and then he was murdered in Dublin.
I served in the Curragh with the Irish Army when I was Dean of Kildare, and that was still that was seen as a very significant
but if that had
rejection.
happened and the UVF had been defeated, would Home Rule have come in?
I don't know.
Why were they against the UVF?
Yes, sorry.
Sadie, you gave a very lovely example of how Armour got attracted to the rights of the tenants. And I just wondered whether you came across any other inkling in his earlier life which led him to be such a extreme member of his class, if you like, in support of the underdog. Were there other issues?
Well, he would have known that, I mean, that his neighbours and, you know, the local people that he would have known, that they would almost all have been tenant farmers or farm labourers, because you know, certainly at that time there wouldn't have been any industry very much apart from a few flax mills in the country and that sort of thing, you know. So he would have been very well aware of. Well, was his, the famine was 1840s. Yeah, it was just 1841. Well, he would have been too young to, you know. Certainly, he would have been a very young child during those famine years, and I'm sure it would have been talked about. You know, about he would have known the hardship.
And you do mention, of course, something that was indelibly in him was that experience when he was a boy, of seeing the arrogant agent
yeah.
really dismissing and uprooting somebody who was really hungry and deprived. It was post-famine, but there was still such injustice.
I wonder how much influence his wife had on him, because his wife was a granddaughter
of Reverend Alexander Staveley.
No, granddaughter of William Staveley.
William Staveley, yeah.
Who was part of the volunteers, the Irish volunteers in the 1780s, but then was on the fringes of the United Irishmen. Although he decried the United Irishmen when they were joining with France, he ended up being imprisoned by the authorities, spent over a year on a prison ship, and that from the Staveley side, he obviously had some inclinations. He chose a wife from that in that vein of. At that stage, the Presbyterians were very much the dissenters and very much on the fringes, very much many of them refusing to take the Regium Donum, the King's Bounty. But in the mid-1800s, with the decline of the Church of Ireland, the established church, and the rise of the benefits, there was a sea change in Presbyterian thought towards the authorities. Previously, they were being kept down. After that, they weren't. So they then didn't have the same interests in opposing. Perhaps they would have been hurting themselves.
That's a good point.
If they were.
His wife was Jenny Adams Staveley Hamilton. She was a widow, and the Reverend Alexander Staveley was her father. Is that right? Yeah. Now, she was from a strong Reformed Presbyterian or Covenanting background, wasn't she? And they were historically, and still are, apolitical. And a good RP will not vote. Perhaps this is pure conjecture, that Jenny was an influence on him because, and the several quotations that I've got down here, that he was absolutely opposed to any party political espousals by his church. And that every church should have no politics here. This is place is for the worship of God. Right. Arguably, he was very political, but this was, I believe, really giving vent to a biblical understanding. We're not talking about party politics. A biblical understanding for social justice. That was deeply within him, and actually comes out in some of his sermons very strongly. This doesn't mean that he was a social gospeler. That's a derogatory description and used by those Christians who were mere social activists with perhaps a shallow or biblical understanding of what God really demands of those he has made in his image. Mere social activism. He was not in that category, I believe, at all. He had a depth, I believe, a theological depth to him. He mightn't have been a card-carrying evangelical Presbyterian, but all his thought, I believe, came out of his understanding of the scriptures, his own passionate belief in God as a God of justice. The other things I could say about his theology, he believed that the theory of evolution was not really an issue. He said whether in 1904, in a series of lectures he gave on sermons, religion or morality, whether human life was created instantaneously or by a long series of developments from lower forms of life is of no practical importance. Nevertheless, he said, preach the word. By it alone and through its spirit, we have life and the church grows. And all our action and belief and practical Christianity is guided and inspired by God's word. Here I am preaching. And I'm just going to shut up, please. But could I say a little bit about his character, a bit more about his character? A moderator said of him, and after his death, he fought a good fight with clean weapons and passed away beloved, not least of those to whose views and projects he was most opposed. I think that's significant. He did love the cut and thrust, didn't he, of verbal battle. It was said of three famous Methodist preachers of the middle of the last century. They were Sangster and Weatherhead and Soper. Sangster loved the Lord. Weatherhead loved people. And Soper loved an argument. There was something of that. There was something of that, wasn't there, in J.B. Armour. He said of a suffragette meeting. There was no opposition, and therefore no fun. But may I share this with you too? And I don't want to suppress any further questions. But he was the strongest, as you've explained so clearly, opponent of Carsonism. And it was, again, it was a moral issue with him. Protestants in the south, and of course Donegal, under Carsonism, would be cut off from their brethren in the north, and there was a large Catholic minority in the north who would be separated from their brethren in the south. He was much opposed, therefore, to the Ulster Covenant. All over Ulster, the churches were opening their doors to the signing of the covenant, the signing of the Covenant of 1912. His church in Ballymoney was close to it, and I think he had the support of his congregation.
I believe so.
I believe so too, and many others there. The UVF. Now, to me, there's a sense in this. The UVF and its gun running, and the army, part of the establishment, was refused to take any action against their illegal activities. Such, obviously, was the power of sentiment in their favour. As you said, the authorities, as it were, virtually ignored the illegalities and the gun runnings of the UVF right under, as it were, their noses. Armour talked about Northerners encouraging the use of force to upset an act of Parliament they disliked. There was a big constitutional, moral and constitutional issue there, as there is arguably at the moment, Robert, over the question of the so-called protocol. Of course, he was shocked by the Sinn Féin Easter Rising in 1916. He did, as you said, Sadie, plead for leniency. Leniency ought, he said, to have been shown, or to be shown, to the dupes. He underestimated, perhaps, the romanticism of Sinn Féin and all that they represented. And a free Catholic Gaelic Ireland, though they would not have claimed to have been sectarian, but still, being Irish, truly Irish, and free from a foreign power and culture, and really, let's face it, a religion. So when they were martyred, as it were, the romance that they represented and preached really spread and took. It inflamed many others who would otherwise have been, as we know, opposed to it. Carson, no. Carson is no statesman, said Armour. however clever he may have been as an advocate, perhaps he might have been thinking of the Oscar Wilde trial, in which, of course, he was enormously successful. Of casement, by way of excusing the man, he wrote in 1916, "It's a tragedy. His actions for the last 2 years can only be judged on the grounds of insanity." That was okay. It was a bit more than that, arguably. Sadie, would you like to say anything else to us?
No, I don't think so. If everyone is, unless anybody wants to ask anything about anything I said, you know.
I'm standing here and I don't want to take over. Declan.
Well, I was just, I'm just going to thank everybody if that's the end of the talk. If there are any more questions, we're happy to take.
I think they've had enough.
Sadie, God bless you. You know, I would have been lost without you.
Oh, nonsense.
No, believe me. And thank you. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much on behalf of the Society, and we'd like to offer our thanks to Sadie Somerville and Reverend Robert Townley. A fascinating talk. I think you will agree that the questions would indeed keep coming. I knew very little about, in fact, nothing about Reverend Armour, and very little about Ballymoney, apart from spending some time working in the Lovell and Christmas Bacon Factory.
Oh. They're giving.
Which I wasn't responsible for, but I was there at the time. But yeah, no, absolutely a very inspiring figure, for sure. Seems to have been a man of great conviction and the courage of his convictions and fighting for fairness and justice for all, particularly in the light of fair rent. I read today about I'm sure you're hearing the price of hotel rooms in Liverpool out of the Eurovision, thousands of pounds for a hotel for night. So talk about fairness of rent, and maybe we could do with some good men like Mr. Armour in these times. So, on behalf of the Society, thank you very much. A fascinating talk, and maybe we'd like to offer our
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Declan.
Thank you very much.